Welcome back to the third podcast in our series, State of the Union. I'm Matthew D. Rose, one of the editors of Brave New Europe. It's our honor to have as tonight's guest, Tara McCormack, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Leicester. Our topic tonight is the militarization of the EU. The EU used to, I don't know if they still do, pride itself in calling itself a force for peace. If you don't remember, in 2012, the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize. The reason given by the committee was, for over 6 decades, the EU has contributed to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy, and human rights in Europe. 11 years later, Josep Borrell, the EU foreign minister, announced EU enlargement policy is a driving force for peace, security, and prosperity for our continent. He was especially referring to 3 nations, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. Well, we've seen what happened to peace, security, and prosperity in Ukraine. We're seeing that Moldova and Georgia could easily go in the same direction. And with the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, it has become apparent for all just how close NATO and the EU are. Our first question for Tara is, when did this symbiosis begin and how developed is it?
All right, thank you very much for asking me on Matthew. I'll try not to get too much into the weeds of history, but I do think it is important to say that I don't think this relationship between the EU and NATO is a new one. I think, and I will try and say this fairly succinctly, with the end of World War II and the establishment of America's rise to hegemony, in Europe, we see 2 tracks. We have NATO, which is the military wing, and the European Economic Community, which obviously comes out of the coal and steel community. The European Economic Community. So we have 2 tracks, and really, if you look at them in terms of the founding members of each and the small expansions in the 70s and 80s, we see that the membership of both institutions virtually always tracks, apart from Ireland, for example, and I'm just saying so it's slightly misleading to look at what happened in the noughties with the Big Bang expansion, when, of course, these states also joined NATO, more or less, over the course of the 90s and noughties, and to think that that is a new thing. So really, in a way, the EU and NATO have always had an extremely intimate relationship. We have, in the post-Cold War, as I said, the Big Bang EU expansion. Most of the states join NATO, and those that don't are basically taken into NATO structures via the Partnership for Peace, the NATO Partnership for Peace, and the Atlantic Council Partnership. I can't remember what the exact word. So really, you have a massive kind of expansion of these military structures. But I guess make an argument about is that this is an ongoing process that is kind of visible at the very start, rather than a kind of sudden shift in relationship.
All right. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO appeared to be obsolete. I don't know if you remember. Later on, Macron said it's brain dead. And in another podcast, you said something which I found very interesting, where you said, we have now experienced how I came to love NATO. Oh. Anyway, can you sort of get us up to that point? What happened after the Cold War ended?
So basically, NATO, after the Cold War, had no purpose. If one understands that its purpose was solely a defensive alliance against Russia. And in fact, certainly in the early 90s, NATO was genuinely in crisis. NATO's 1991, called something like New Strategic Direction, actually says we are now going to be an organization that fights against uncertainty. I mean, it's quite comical when you read it, sort of risk uncertainty, because there is no reason for NATO to survive. But that's if we understand NATO to be solely about the Soviet Union. I would say that that isn't the case. And actually, Lord Ismay, the first General Secretary, the Secretary General of NATO, quipped, I'm sure people know this, what's the role of NATO? It's to keep the Soviets out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And I think that is probably, although just a throwaway quip, is probably actually it's still kind of quite a good description of NATO. So the role NATO persisted with the end of the Cold War because it was a fundamental part of American hegemony over the European continent. And the Soviet Union, as it arose, was of course helpful in that, but not the not the initial rationale for it. And for that, I said we have to go back and think about that post-war order. So the one thing that wasn't going to happen to NATO was that it was going to be wrapped up and everyone told to go home. And then as we have the Big Bang expansion, which obviously begins in the 90s in terms of the so-called transformation of the former Warsaw Pact states and Soviet states, NATO then begins to reframe itself in terms of values. We're not a security alliance. We are an alliance that is supporting democracy, that is about ensuring human rights, etc. So NATO has kind of constantly been reinventing itself, or at least in terms of the public narrative. So that is, I would argue, the reason why NATO persisted, because of its role in terms of ensuring American military direction, hegemony, however you want to put it, over European states. And the end of the Cold War is a tremendous opportunity, of course, for that. We have some initial, as we know, in 1988, 99, there's quite a bit of a conflict amongst European governments in terms of whether, should a united nation, Germany be allowed into NATO, all sorts of discussions about what was promised to the USSR, etc. But once that is, agreed and kind of that a united Germany can go into NATO, we then see the kind of push to expand NATO and reframing NATO as part of the new post-Cold War kind of democratic Europe.
I think an important event that if you're old enough to remember it, was the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. I mean, that was against international law. It saw the attack of civilian centers. For example, Belgrade. As a journalist, we shall all never forget that the television studios were targeted and many civilians were killed. And this is something I think that sets, did it set a tone, or was it just a logical next step, or what was this?
No, well, definitely. So the 1990s. So first of all, you had also NATO intervention in Bosnia in 94 when NATO bombed the Bosnian Serbs. And Germany, indeed, has to actually change its constitution to allow the German army to participate in this so-called humanitarian intervention. 1999, of course, then we have I think it's 73 or 78 day NATO bombing of Serbia, ostensibly in support of the independence for Kosovo. Absolutely, it attacks. So civilians are hurt. Of course, famously, the Chinese embassy was bombed, which was an interesting moment. As you said, RTS was bombed. So this is all done under the auspices of so-called humanitarian intervention. And humanitarian intervention was a doctrine that emerges in the 90s, and the argument is explicitly made. You can look at people like Tony Blair, Václav Havel. Everyone says sovereignty is over. We are in a new world in which human rights are going to be protected. Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch says human rights trump sovereignty. And then in 2001, you have this document called the Responsibility to Protect document, which essentially reframes sovereignty. It says, look, sovereignty in terms of non-intervention and sovereign equality is over. And when we say sovereignty, we mean to what extent is a state protecting its people? And if it's not sovereign. Therefore, the international community has a right and a duty to intervene and effectively, in this kind of interesting sleight of hand, give sovereignty back, almost. But now that doctrine of humanitarian intervention, and of course, sorry, and you're right, so just to point out, of course, this was completely illegal. The British House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee report after Kosovo said the Kosovo intervention was illegal but moral. So this is a really interesting discussion. But now, of course, this new doctrine of intervention and kind of scrapping the UN Charter framework is a source of enormous concern to Russia, China, Brazil, and you hear arguments from these states saying, well, is this not a recipe for endless war, essentially, and simply allows powerful states to decide, well, which states are not being sovereign and could do with a little bit of bombing in order to, restore their sovereignty and protect people's human rights, including presumably the cleaners at RTS who were on the receiving end of the NATO bomb. So this development of humanitarian intervention is already seen as quite problematic. At the time, as we know, Russia is basically down and out, collapsed under Jeffrey Sachs's shock doctrine, but begins to revive, ironically, under Putin in the kind of late 90s, early noughties. But there's already a sense that the post-Cold War order is one in which the Western powers are dominating. And certainly at the end...
It's come up again, this whole topic, because the difference between the rule of law, which existed, and suddenly rule-based society, which is rule-based order, which is based upon the interpretation of the West.
Yeah, that is essentially, you have international law, which is essentially a set treaties and agreements. I mean, there's a fair academic discussion. Is international law as such, in that it is a set of interstate agreements and treaties, but international law, as understood post 1945, is one in which sovereign equality and non-intervention are the cornerstones of international peace and security. And in the 90s, particularly with the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, that is all ripped up. I said, with arguments, well, sovereignty is old hat. We're in a new world order where we will protect human rights, and humanitarian intervention is kind of permissible, even if it's not legal, as the House of Commons says, it's moral. And this is what is called the rules-based international order. But of course, it's not based on the post-World War II legal order. It is based on essentially rule by the Western powers.
Which is also what happened with NATO and the EU as they began this eastward expansion. They were dictating the rules. And as we know, Russia, even Yeltsin said, we don't want this. We don't want you coming so close to our borders.
Yeah, so this has been a long-running discussion. So we in the West, in Europe, in the UK, in the States, the Ukraine conflict is presented as something that has kind of sprung up out of nowhere, almost, and of course is to do with Russian imperial ambitions or so on. But I would argue that you can very much see the roots of it in that early push for NATO expansion. Now, this was pushed by Clinton, the Clinton administration, and of course done in the name of values, human rights, etc. But it was well known at the time, not just explicitly from Russia, but within America as well, that NATO expansion was going to cause serious security problems. There's a great article, an interview with George Kennan in the New York Times in 1998, where he says, NATO expansion is a serious mistake. And we are going to antagonize Russia, and we shouldn't be doing it. So it is well known that NATO expansion is going to be a problem for Russia. And that, of course, is ignored. We have then in 2008 at, I can't remember is this the Madrid summit 2008? I'm sure someone can correct me, where America basically says NATO has an open door policy. And it says this specifically to Georgia and Ukraine. Almost immediately, we have a conflict between Russia and Georgia. So this is an ongoing source of tension, essentially. Really since 2008, but prior to that with NATO expansion. And it's quite interesting. Obama was asked, why didn't you respond to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014? And Obama actually says, well, it's not really of that much of a fundamental US interest, but we know that it is for Russia. And that even modicum of sense seems to have been totally ditched after that.
Before, I mentioned we all thought NATO was dead. There was another element that we thought was dead as well, and that was the humanitarian war, that after the Iraq war, the second one, this was not credible anymore. And it's made a complete comeback in Ukraine. Suddenly, it's a humanitarian war.
Well, don't forget also 2011, NATO's Libya disaster. This is an intervention that's supposedly legitimated by a UN Security Council resolution, which mentions the responsibility to protect this doctrine. And that also was quite interesting in terms of developing tension between NATO and Russia and China, because Russia and China abstain on the UN Security Council resolution, which authorizes, all necessary means. And abstention is basically a way of saying, okay, in a face-saving way. But then what happens rather than a limited humanitarian operation. And I think there is a lot one could argue about that. I think it would be problematic, full stop. But rather than a limited humanitarian operation, Britain and France worked behind the scenes to overthrow Gaddafi. And that is also using jihadi groups to overthrow Gaddafi, and that's documented as well. That's a really interesting episode, and indeed one of those Libyan jihadis is a Libyan British guy who Salman Abedi and his family are allowed to travel to and from Libya to train with jihadi groups. They live in Britain, and Salman Abedi, of course, then went on to commit mass murder at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. So behind the scenes, you have this working to overthrow Gaddafi. And of course, Libya is consequently a catastrophe. CNN goes to Libya in 2017 and finds you can buy slaves there. So that also is a bone of contention, in that whether one agrees with it or not, Russia and China thought they were signing up to a sort of limited humanitarian intervention, but behind the scenes, Western states are essentially want to depose Gaddafi. So then what's really interesting, 2015, I think, the Syrian President Assad asks Russia for help against the West's proxy war. You know, the sort of billions of pounds that are being chucked into various anti-government militias and jihadi groups from the UAE, Turkey, Britain, the States. And Russia basically says, yeah, we're not going to have Libya and Iraq again. Yeah. So I think so humanitarian intervention, even after Iraq, was still bubbling there.
What's come with this resurgence of humanitarian wars is we've seen almost a complete disappearance of geopolitical discussions, which, you know, it's all been it's all moral, which was normal for the US and Britain in the past, but I have a feeling it's new for the EU. And I'm not quite sure where this came from.
Well, I suppose going back to humanitarian intervention, that was the great sort of way, that was the great framing, you know, reframing international relations as a moral sphere rather than a geopolitical sphere. So Blair famously in 1999, in response to Kosovo, makes his famous Chicago speech where he says, this is a just war. It is a war for values, not for interests. So you have almost a really interesting kind of reframing of Western war. But then also, don't forget, the EU as well, post-Cold War, very much frames itself in terms of liberal values, democracy. Ian Manners, an academic, people may or may not have heard of him, wrote a famous article in 2002 where he calls the EU a normative power. And the reason for that is, he says, look, we have transformed the European continent, not through force, through democracy, through the fact that each state has had to digest the, 5 million pages of the acquis communautaire and change, what they call the police commissioner. So he says, this is how the EU works. And there's a really interesting discussion in the noughties and supported by people like Robert Cooper, the British Eurocrat, who make this argument that the EU is a normative power. It does not act through force, doesn't change people's interests. It acts through the rule of law, democracy, etc. Now I would argue, obviously, that's a bit of flannel in that you have an ongoing militarisation, really, and the EU is always, as I said, the other side to NATO. But you do have that really interesting discussion. So look how we've expanded, and it's all been voluntary, and it's all about law and rights and democracy and etc. So certainly the rhetoric has changed. Now we have, arguments that, well, we are the EU is in a state of war, needs to move to a war economy for the sake of peace, obviously, always.
But in how far did the EU go into this willingly? It's not a coincidence that the Americans blew up Nord Stream.
No.
And let's look at Orban as well, where he said, I'm not going to support funding of the Ukraine war. And they said, all right, but we'll crush your economy.
Absolutely. Well, or Fico in Slovakia, who's currently in hospital. It's supposedly by a citizen who dislikes his arguments about Ukraine. I think there has been some contestation within the EU. Britain, of course, not a member of the EU anymore, but Britain, as we know, has been leading the European charge in terms of sending missiles, everything that we possibly can, in order to endanger ourselves by fighting a more and more intense proxy war with Russia. But Macron as well. It's, the two former real colonial powers have always kind of wanted to be seen as, the best satraps to the US, basically. I think Germany has historically, as in recent history, attempted to maintain a fairly positive, a better relationship with Russia until recently. But I think the Nord Stream destruction, and that Germany has simply accepted it, is a very clear sign that Germany also has entirely capitulated to American interests. And indeed, across the EU, it's almost farcical. The exceptional lack of interest in who blew up Nord Stream is, but that just shows. I think this Nord Stream, in a way, is the kind of end of the road, the final capitulation. There is no alternative anymore. Even of minor differences.
I mean, the European economy, especially Germany, is in tatters right now, going downhill, and they all seem to accept that, and they accept the fact that a nuclear war can break out at any moment. And so the security is threatened as well. They seem to be accepting everything right now.
It's very difficult to understand. I mean, first of all, you have, and you will be able to say more about this than me, but I don't know what media discussion is like in Germany. I have heard that's a bit better, but, we have the British media does not function media. Essentially, the British media functions in order to share government narratives. So
I hate to say it, but German media is even worse. But that would be an evening filling program.
Surely not. Apart from maybe 2 or 3 journalists in the UK, and of course, we're not saying alternative websites such as Brave New Europe, but the mainstream the legacy media, let me put it properly, the legacy media serves to absolutely simply funnel government narratives. So there is to draw on an old term, manufacturing of consent. And of course, what Chomsky and Herman didn't mean that people are idiots, but there is no public discussion permitted of any. So what I was going to say, so it's quite difficult to tell what people really are thinking. I mean, there is the average person in Britain has no desire to go to war with Russia and would be stunned to, you know, if one were to say to them, you do realize how dangerous things are, but that discussion is simply not allowed. You know, no discussion. Even Cameron the other day, you know, saying, oh yes, of course Ukraine can lob our missiles into Russia. I mean, there was an article, and then that's it. It's phenomenal. So
yes, it's so different here, which brings me to the, you know, let's go over to the political side now. You know just as well as I do that the German foreign minister, Butcher Baerbock, says, you know, I support Ukraine no matter what voters think.
Yeah,
we're talking about sovereignty.
Absolutely, and that is exactly the same in the UK. Constantly, you know, whether it's Rishi Sunak or Cameron or the defense secretary, everyone say, you know, yes, we will support Ukraine whatever it takes, as long as it takes. Well, I'm sorry, no one asked us.
I think, in fact, I have this from you, that what's occurred, and by the way, I just wanted to say there are polls being done in Germany as well, and the majority of the populace definitely does not support the war in Ukraine, and they don't support the genocide by Israel in Gaza either, but that doesn't seem to be important. And you brought up this point that this is the neoliberal concept of democracy, the end of popular sovereignty, removing citizens from political participation. Not only do they not have, you know, any sort of discussion in the media, but look at politics. Look at Britain. You have a Labour Party and a Tory Party, and there's no difference. It's the same in Germany until this party BSW came along. There was no contradiction politically.
There's no difference between Labour and Conservatives, and the so-called insurgent party reform is really offering very little difference there.
Speaking of insulating, I think another phenomenon which no one notices, because let's be honest, despite all the British claiming, oh, you know, we're so attached to the EU, it's so important, I don't think hardly anyone in Europe knows what the EU does and what it's about. And what they've been able to do is, you know, of course, spending money on the war in Ukraine is not popular. And, you know, you have in the US, you know, a lot of, you know, this saying, well, why is there money for Ukraine, but not for this and this and this? And the lovely thing is that the EU, we're talking about militarization tonight, has expanded its military budget, which means it doesn't appear in anyone's, you know, any nation's budget. So you can't say, well, you know, we're talking about tens of billions of euros. And no one can say, well, yeah, they're spending it on, you know, our government is spending on this Ukraine war, this useless war. And, you know, someone does say, well, that's, you know, it's the EU spending their money. The EU has no money, can't tax it, gets all its money from nations, which that is one reason why they want to expand the budget, which in that moment, you will have the nations having to contribute more. And this is for military.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, there's no one really checking what's happening to all this money. And last but not least, you know, no one's standing up for this. There's no one you can blame. It's just sort of happening unseen. And you have some of the most absurd things. For example, there's this would come out of Orwell. There's a European peace facility that's now 12 billion euros, which was originally for Africa. It's all being moved over to Ukraine. You know,
yeah.
have the defense fund for Ukraine, that's 5 billion a year going over at least.
Yeah. Well, yes, absolutely, very similar. You know, I don't have the figures in front of me in terms of the billions that the UK has sent to Ukraine. Yeah, but then we have the problem that this is a policy that essentially all the political elites have. Well, some of them support it. You know, I said Macron wants to be the best satrap he can, but even, you know, countries that were not wanted to keep some relationship with Russia have basically knuckled down and accepted this policy. So this is why it can be this kind of incredible, what would you call it even, you know, yes, just you can plow billions and billions. No one will stop it apart from perhaps, well, who is speaking against it? Orban and Fico, who's currently in hospital. So there is no one, and we know in the European Parliament, apart from, you know, a handful of MEPs, obviously Claire Daly, Mick Wallace, a handful of others, there is no one who will be speaking out and making the kind of democratic case against this policy. So it's quite a sort of it's a very depressing scene when you think about it all.
What also surprises me is, you know, how quiet, you know, all these EU NGOs are about this, because the money, you know, since the budget isn't increasing, has to be taken from other areas of the EU budget. A lot of it is what was called the Green Deal. It was supposed to be used. Some of it is for social education. And, you know, these NGOs apparently so afraid to say this war is having this effect. It says a lot about, you know, the current mood of fear. Germany is exceptional, but I think it's throughout the EU.
Yes, well, and in the UK. But I think that's also that manufacturing consent point, which, as I said, is not about people being brainwashed at all, but it is about the establishment creating the narrative that is acceptable, and to deviate from that narrative is to open oneself up to accusations of being, you know, pro-Putin or whatever, said, you know, pro-Iran, you know, so whatever old nonsense they want to put it. But that is and that also is related to the way the media is functioning. So to deviate a tiny bit and say, well, okay, what about money for whatever, potholes or, you know, women's refuge, I don't know, anything you want, is to invite, you know, scorn, denunciations, and so on. So that's the problem, really, that so few people, even out of self-interest, will argue against this insane policy, or the kind of militarization of the EU and funneling billions into a war which we know can only end, well, either in a absolutely catastrophic international nuclear war, or with some kind of deal between Ukraine and Russia. And we know already that in 2020, in April 22, there were very, very serious negotiations, and Boris Johnson, I'm presuming directed by Biden, went to Ukraine and said to Zelensky, well, you might be ready to negotiate, but we're not. Keep fighting. Yeah, so the whole thing, it seems probably very difficult to comprehend, really.
Well, there isn't even any sort of discussion going on, much less negotiations with regard to ending the war. And there have been some critics who have even gone so far as to say, you know, the war is going so well for Russia right now, why should they even want to negotiate? They're going to be able to, if this continues as it appears to be developing, they'll be able to dictate, you know, the peace.
Yeah,
the question is, what does NATO and EU do in that moment?
Well, exactly. So that, I think that's a really good. I'm glad you brought that up. So it seems to me that I think just as at the start of the war, I think it was a very kind of frightening period, really, in terms of what would NATO do. But I think if the war draws to a close, we are in a really uncertain time, because exactly as NATO and the EU have basically said, this war is existential for us, and if he wins in Ukraine, will be marching on Warsaw and Paris and, you know, London next, and all this absolute nonsense. But so what we have seen, as we know that Ukraine is having a really hard time currently on the battlefield and Russia has the upper hand, I guess this is what we are seeing now, is we have people like Cameron going and saying to Ukraine, yes, do what you like with our missiles. Blinken, as we know, has just been to Kiev, played a little guitar in a band, and has also said, basically, publicly. Now, I'm sure privately, obviously, we don't know what has been said in terms of Ukraine using NATO weaponry, but Blinken has now said publicly, well, we don't dictate to Ukraine how they use the weapons, we give them, that's up to us. We've had Macron's insane pledges, you know, of course, why shouldn't we put troops on the ground if needed? I think I was reading something from one of the Estonian foreign minister, possibly, again, also saying, yes, we've been talking about offering troops maybe to go to West Ukraine to, I think what they call in military circles, backfill, to allow more soldiers to go to the front, because of course Ukraine's having a dreadful time with manpower as well, because many people are leaving Ukraine illegally. We know that men of conscriptional age can't do, but are leaving however they can, because unsurprisingly they don't want to be sent to war. So that is a real issue, and I think we are actually entering a really worrying, even more worrying, if it could be, time, because exactly what happens when it looks like it's ending, and that existential war, which we've been told is why we can't have hospitals and have our roads filled, potholes filled, and etc. That existential war is not going to be won in the way that we say is existential for us. Then what happens?
I think you're being very kind when you even make room for, you know, the argument of existential war. In Germany, it's, you know, clearly the government says this is evil against good. It's become that more. And how can a government then say, well, evil won?
Evil won. Yes, absolutely. Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that's why I think we are seeing some of this sort of mad stuff about, you know, troops and, you know, we'll do what you want with the weapons. So that is a real, a very, very worrying time ahead. I mean, on the other hand, such is the sort of kind of craziness of contemporary political life, things can also just drop out of public sight like a stone as well. So who knows?
I know I'm going out of your field, which is international relations. This is getting more towards the military, but you know, in the course of the last couple of decades, we've seen how the US has outsourced its armed forces. And I wonder how far, we're going, I think we already are seeing this happening in Ukraine with it's called mercenaries now, or there's an international brigade in the Ukrainian army. We know, the Russians are holding, are bringing in people from outside.
Yeah.
How far is, we also had that leaked tape from the German generals who said, well, the Brits, of course, have their people in Ukraine guiding, who do the missile guiding for the Ukrainians because they don't know how to do it.
Yeah.
So the question is, how far could we be in this already without it being officially?
Well, well, this is, again, I mean, in a way, one of the really striking things about the war so far is the extent to which both sides have not responded. Now, British special forces, French special forces, I'm sure German special forces have been in Ukraine from the start, well, from before the start. In the build-up, the Ukrainian army, as with other armies, has become, probably the interoperable, if that's the right word, with NATO. And that's been a steady build-up, very particularly post 2014. So it is without a doubt that Ukraine is crawling with Western special forces, soldiers maybe, helping to operate systems. We know, for example, that the massive weapons depots in Poland and things are just sort of trundled across the border into Ukraine. So the astonishing thing is how much has happened that both sides are not talking about. So I don't know, we are already thoroughly engaged in a proxy war. We know that Russia knows that. Russia obviously says that quite often, but it doesn't do anything apart from, blows up NATO weapons stores in Ukraine and occasionally special forces. So yeah, that is a good question. I don't know. We are thoroughly in it. Tomorrow, it could all change. Tomorrow, the rhetoric could all change because the reality has been such for a considerable period now. So, yeah.
We're nearing the end of the podcast. I'd like to take a big step back now and look at this again politically. So we have a war, and also to a large part a support of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Who was the first person who ran over and told Netanyahu we're going to support you? It was the president of the Commission, von der Leyen. So we have a political class that has disconnected from its citizens. We have a war which actually no one really wants, except for I'd say you have some of the metropolitan elite who want it, and third you have citizens who are in, I don't know from which nations, but I surely know in Britain and in Germany, who are intimidated from speaking out. It's in Germany, at least, it's very, very dangerous. You can lose your job. People do lose their jobs. I mean, it went that far that there was a case of Varoufakis, and then here with oh God, what's his name from the University of Glasgow?
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
The whole of Schengen for a year, so that he could not speak. It's just this. In Germany, it's I hate to say it, but it's almost a reign of terror. It's going. People are so afraid to speak out. Go onto the street. Much it's not like Britain. I'm always amazed when I see Bristol has a demonstration in support of Palestine with 8,000 or 10,000 people, and in Berlin it's 2,000. We're a city of almost 4 million people, and of those 2,000, very few have white skin.
No.
So what is the EU now? It's certainly not a guarantor of security, of well-being. What were the terms used that I read initially? Peace, security, and prosperity.
Yeah.
None of these.
Well, no,
We can put that on the list too. None of this exists anymore.
no. I mean, and whether it does, as I said, because I think the origins of the role of the EU was always, to protect political elites from the demos, and that was framed, in the 50s and 60s. The crazy people will go to war, so we need to kind of, depoliticize areas of policy. And also, it was particularly to advance the interests of capital as favoured by American hegemony. So, if you recall, so I don't know what the debate was like in Germany, but in the 60s and 70s in the UK, Labour argued against joining the EEC, or a significant chunk of the Labour Party, because they said it's a club for capitalists. We can't have what we would socialist policies under the EU. So the EU has always been premised on removing more and more areas of policy out, from the protecting more and more areas of policy from democratic pressure. So in that respect, again, things haven't, the sort of fundamental kernel of what it is hasn't changed.
It's just, as you said, it's been on a trajectory, and it just, what should I say? It's sort of becoming more and more threadbare. The whole discourse around the EU.
Yeah, I think that's obviously true. Yeah, I think that's true. And as you have the kind of quite significant shift in the way that governments operate, really beginning the sort of late 70s, 80s, 90s, states no longer govern. States can't control capital. That's no longer their role. It's that sort of thing. So, of course, the justifications then become more difficult. So,
but the thing is, I could say the EU is leading its citizens into war, but it really isn't. It's they've capitulated, or they've just said, the US is in charge here.
Yeah, that's
not only our foreign policy, but also with our domestic policies, and they're being led into a situation, and it's a number of people keep emphasizing that it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
In international politics, things can go very wrong very fast, and you're somewhere where you don't want to be. Just think about the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean the European elites, including Britain, have really given up in a way. I mean, even thinking back historically, I was thinking about in the 60s, de Gaulle's and the Fichet plan, where he wanted to get rid of NATO, have an independent EC, or even Britain did not want to have anything to do with the Vietnam War, for example. You just cannot imagine that kind of independence, even within the broader hegemonic structure, but you cannot imagine that kind of assertion of some kind of national interests, even though within a broader hegemonic context. But even with it, there was some kind of sense of national interest, but that has totally disappeared, sadly.
Especially in the West European nations, because we do have Hungary, we do have Slovakia. You did have voices, or you do have voices contradicting this
Yeah,
current war trajectory on which we are on.
this is true. Zoran Milanovic, I think the president of Croatia has also been. There was such a funny clip of him responding to Barbrook when she said, "We're at war with Russia," and there's a clip of him saying, "We're at war with Russia? That I didn't know." And he says, "Maybe Germany's at war." It's hilarious. He said, "Because maybe Germany's at war with Russia." And then he says, "Well, I hope that it works out for them better than it did last time." I mean, it's really funny. So there are. Yeah,
I never heard this.
It's brilliant, and he says it in Croatian. But you have to kind of understand that to really get the tone. But yeah, so there are some voices of sense, but whether they'll be enough or I don't know. Who knows? Who knows?
Well, as Wolfgang Streeck always says, as long as Germany is financing the EU, they're the hegemons. They're going to more or less dictate.
Yeah.
Although, as I said beforehand, I think they've lost this role. They've just given it up to the US and are just trying to, not to get, too committed. The whole thing with the Taurus missiles with Scholz.
Yeah.
The first has to do with domestic politics because he knows it's not popular. Second of all, you have to be stupid not to realize that Russia is part of Europe, and it was economically a very important part of Europe until recently.
Yes, until European states and Britain decided to, add to an already bad economy by further, destroying their economy in support of misperceived American strategic interests, basically.
Anyway, do you see a way out of this, or is the EU and Europe, including Britain, simply now being herded into whatever they're being herded into?
I really don't know. I don't at the moment. And as we were saying earlier on, I think that particularly given Ukraine's position on the at the moment in the war, in terms of the war, it's an even more dangerous period. So I just don't know. I mean, one can hope that maybe there'd be a change with the American election, but I can't really see that. I don't think, not that one would necessarily want Trump to win the election, but I don't think Trump would represent any significant foreign policy change, sadly. So.
All right, Tara, thank you very, very much. It was an informative interview, at least for me. I hope for the audience as well.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for asking me.
All right. We'd like to thank the audience for having joined us. I hope you picked up on the other two podcasts there. You can find them on our YouTube channel. So if you do want to get caught up, that was with Wolfgang Streeck and with Kostas Lapavitsas. The topics were Quo Vadis, the European Union, and with Kostas, it was about the EU economy, in which state it is. So do have a look there. Tara, we'll keep in contact.
Thank you, Matthew. Yes, definitely. Thank you very much for asking me.
All right, I'll be in London in June.
All right,
are you living in Leicester or are you living in London?
London. So let's be in contact. All right.
All right.
Thank you, Matthew. Bye.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
you.